we stand as the ones redeemed, as we lift up our hearts and sing. We are more than conquerors. We are more than conquerors. God, if you are for us, who can be against us? We are more than conquerors. We are more than conquerors. God, if you are for us, who can be against us? What can separate us from your love? By the blood of the Lamb, by the word of our testimony, the enemy has been, the enemy will be defeated. By the blood of the Lamb, by the word of our testimony, the enemy has been, the enemy will be defeated. By the blood of the Lamb, by the word of our testimony, the enemy has been, the enemy will be defeated. We are more than conquerors. We are more than conquerors. God, if you are for us, who can be against us? We are more than conquerors. We are more than conquerors. God, if you are for us, who can be against us? What can separate us from your love? Amen. You may be seated. I have a few announcements today pertaining to things that are coming up in the not too distant future. First of all, our regular weekly ministries are back to normal this week. We had our prayer meeting this morning. We have a prayer meeting on Mondays at 4. We have a prayer meeting on Tuesdays at 6, and you are all invited to all of those. Come and pray with us. You can never pray too much, and it's wonderful to be with God's people praying and bringing the concerns that we have before the Lord. And then on Thursday morning, we have Jesus and Joe. We're finishing up our study in Judges this week, so the last 2 chapters we're going to talk about on Thursday morning. And then on Thursday night, we have our regular youth group meeting. Youth group goes from 5 to 7, so anybody between the 6th and 12th grade, you are welcome to come and join us for that. We have a great time. The kids enjoy one another's company and the time that we spend there. And those are just kind of our regular weekly things. But then we've got some other things that are coming up after that. And one of the things that's coming up is on July 11th, we've got a missionary guest that is coming. His name is Daniel Tok. He is from Romania, and he will be here on Sunday, July 11th. He's going to present his ministry. He's going to preach that morning. And then afterwards, we're going to have a lunch over in the fellowship hall and just have time to ask him questions and interact with him. He's a really neat guy. Everybody, whenever I say he's from Romania, they go, Transylvania, which Transylvania is a part of Romania. So, like, he will talk about that. People, that's kind of their impression of Romania is, you have vampires. Well, I won't be going there. To my knowledge, they do not have any vampires or that those are real at all. But in any case, that's going on the 11th of July, but we need people to bring things for the luncheon. And so there is a sign-up out in the foyer, correct, Sue? Foyer? Oh, I'm sorry, on the wall. It's in here with us now. It's right on the back wall there next to Tom. And so if you would like to bring something for that luncheon, sign up for that. And that's always a good time when we get to interact with the missionaries and kind of learn more about what they're doing. So that's going on. And then the other thing is that the second weekend of August, we have our vacation. First weekend of August, we have our Vacation Bible School, and that's for all of the children. And anybody that wants to sign up and help with that, we've got a sign-up sheet out in the foyer there. We need a lot of help. We need help building. We need help dealing with the kids. We need help with snacks. We need help with decorations. We need help with music. So there's just all kinds of areas. Vacation Bible School is a great opportunity for the whole church to come together and minister to the kids of our community and of the valley. And normally we have a lot of kids that come. And so it's a good time for us to reach out to our community and to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with the kids. So those are the things that are coming up. Now, the thing that I forgot to do right when I started these announcements was say Happy Father's Day to all of the fathers that are here.
The depths I cry to you. In darkest places I will call. Incline your ear to me anew, and hear my cry for mercy, Lord. Were you to count my sinful ways, could I come before your throne? Yet full forgiveness meets my gaze. I stand redeemed by grace alone. I will wait for you, I will wait for you on your word. I will rely, I will wait for you, surely wait for you, till my soul is satisfied. So put your hope in God alone. Take courage in His power to save, completely and forever won by Christ emerging from the grave. I will wait for you, I will wait for you on your word. I will rely, I will wait for you, surely wait for you, till my soul is satisfied. I will wait for you, I will wait for you, on your word I will rely. I will wait for you, surely wait for you, till my soul is satisfied. His steadfast love has made a way, and God Himself has paid the price, that all who trust in Him today find healing in His sacrifice. I will wait for you, I will wait for you, through the storm and through the night. I will wait for you, surely wait for you, for your love is my delight. I will wait for you, I will wait for you, on your word I will rely. I will wait for you, surely wait for you, till my soul is satisfied. I will wait for you, I will wait for you, on your word I will rely. I will wait for you, surely wait for you, till my soul is satisfied. God, we come to you today, and we thank you that because of your steadfast love, you've made a way, and you yourself paid the price for our sins. And so we can come to you with confidence in your love for us, in your provision for us through Jesus Christ. And so we just pray as we come today to learn more about you and to get into your word, that you would open our eyes to see what you would have us to see, that your Spirit would fill Ben and give him the words to speak, that you would give us ears to hear, and that we would understand more about you, more about all of the aspects of your nature, and that we would come to know and to love you more, even as you love us unconditionally no matter what, because of your amazing nature and the fact that you never change. And so we just thank you and praise you for your goodness and your grace to us. Help us to know and to love you more. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. We will try that video again at the end of the service. I'm not a quitter. I'm not giving up. Ben's criticizing me over here. He was like, on Father's Day. He quit videos on Father's Day. All right. A number of years ago, there was a video game that was released in the late 90s, and the video game was called Grand Theft Auto. And as you can imagine, not an altogether wholesome game, because the point of the game was you continue to carjack people and steal cars and run from the police. And this game came out, and it did well enough to warrant a sequel, and the sequel came out, which is pretty much the same kind of thing. This is I got a screen cap from the original. Nothing really gruesome. It's just unwholesome content. But then in 2001, Rockstar Games got a hold of this, and they decided that they were going to make this a first-person shooter type game, or something where you got to be a little more interactive with the crime. And they released Grand Theft Auto 3. And in this game, you played a street thug who was working his way up through a criminal organization. And the game offered you the opportunity as a player to carjack people, to run them over, to beat them with baseball bats, to shoot them, to stab them, to do heinous acts of violence, all while running from the police or running over the police. Now, conventional wisdom would tell us that a game like this would probably not do too well and probably would not be welcomed into many homes, because most parents are probably not okay, if they know what's happening, with their kids playing a murder simulator in their house. But conventional wisdom would turn out to be wrong, because this game would actually spawn multiple sequels here, sequel after sequel of continued violence, and it would go on to sell 140 million copies, and by the time it's run, or by now, 2020, it had grossed $6 billion. This video game, Grand Theft Auto 5, $6 billion, because it turns out that violence sells in our culture. Now, take into account all of the movies, the television shows, even the violence we find in music and things like that, and we have a culture that is saturated with violence. And the result is, no surprise, we have a lot of violence in our culture. A number of years ago, I went to Paris, and I was doing some ministry there for 2 weeks. And at one point in this trip, I ended up staying outside of town, and I had to walk. Every time I'd go back, I have to walk from the train station to where I was staying. And it was dark, and it didn't look like a very good place. And so I asked my friend Todd, the missionary, I said, Todd, what are the chances that I'm going to get mugged? And he said, pretty low. He says, you walk, you talk, and you look like an American, and the Parisians all think that Americans are incredibly violent and unpredictable people. Now, for me, that worked out pretty well in not getting mugged on my way to my apartment. But it says something about our culture in general. That violence is something that we can observe in our culture, and it's something that others look at our culture and say it's filled with violence. Now, we're not the only culture in the world that's fairly violent. And we're not the most violent culture in the history of the world. I mean, we have to compete with the Aztecs and the Assyrians and the Celts and the Vikings and all of these other violent cultures that were saturated in death and destruction. And one of the most violent cultures that we know of was the Babylonian culture. And this takes us back into our series this morning in the book of Habakkuk. We're talking about God bringing judgment down upon the Babylonians. This is chapter 2. It's all about God's judgment upon Babylon. And one of the reasons why God judged this nation is because of their violence and their destructive tendencies. If you were somebody who was living in the shadow of the Babylonian invasion, there was fear. For those in Jerusalem who were awaiting this to come, there was fear. They were known for their ferocity, for their efficiency in war. They were known for humiliating and dehumanizing the nations that they captured. They were known for doing incredible acts of violence. And for Habakkuk, the prospect that God would use Babylon and would bring this nation in order to judge his people was deeply problematic, because it seemed to him to go against the character of God. And after all, last week we talked about the fact that these Babylonians were takers, right? We're in like a three-part mini-series within the series, the takers, the breakers, and the God makers. And we talked last week about the theft and the taking of property. This week we're talking about the breaking of things and the violence. Next week we're going to talk about idolatry. But last week we had mentioned that in God's law, he said, don't covet and don't steal. Those are 2 of the top 10, right? And then we look at the law this week and we see God said, don't murder, don't commit murder. And we see that's part of God's law that he wrote upon the tablets of stone and that he writes upon our hearts. It didn't just happen in the law. The very first after mankind had rebelled and pridefully been kicked out of the garden, the first sin that we see happening is Cain slays Abel. Murder is one of the very first sins that are ever committed, and he's punished for that. When God sent mankind out after the flood in the book of Genesis, one of the first things that he tells them is that it's not right for a man to take another man's life, and if somebody murders another person, that person should be put to death because of the crime in which they've committed. So we see that God has a high view of life, a low view of murder, that he has a low view of violence and destruction. And yet Babylon has rolled through city after city, nation after nation, causing destruction everywhere they went. And so Habakkuk's cry in the previous chapter is, God, are you going to allow them to just continue to do this forever? They go out here and they destroy and they cause death and destruction. Are you just going to let them keep doing that? And all of chapter 2, the point of chapter 2 is that God is just, God will balance things, and God will ensure that those who do these things meet justice. So this morning, we're in Habakkuk chapter 2. If you've got your Bibles open to that. If not, open them to Habakkuk chapter 2. If you don't know where that is, go to Matthew and flip back a few pages, and you will find this tiny 3-chapter book called Habakkuk. And in chapter 2, we're going to read verses 12 through 17. And this is what it says. It says, "Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as waters cover the sea. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and you make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to the cities, and to all who dwell in them." So today, that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about God judging the violence of Babylon. And we're going to observe 3 things this morning. First of all, how the Babylonians used violence in order to build their world. And then we're going to look at how God is going to flip the script on them, and they're going to drink that which they tried to make other people drink. And then we're going to see the overall benefit that comes when God acts in justice. Sorry, that really bugs me when I can see in that back room there. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make an observation here about the way of the breakers. If you're taking notes this morning, you'll see the outline up here, the way of the breakers. We're going to see this in verses 12, 15, and 17. The Babylonians, as we saw last week when we looked at the picture of the Ishtar Gate and of the city, they built some beautiful things, but along the way, they also broke a lot of things. They also destroyed a lot of things. And one of the things that Babylon was known to do is as they were going across the earth, they would just grind up peoples and nations through their violent actions. God reveals for us in this message to Habakkuk 3 ways in which they did that. First, they acted in cruelty. They cruelly shamed, exposed, and took advantage of others. If you look at verse 15, this is what it says. "Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink and pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze upon their nakedness." What it tells us here is that they're uncovering the nakedness and the shame of their neighbors in order to humiliate them. Now, something we need to understand about the Bible is that the Bible is not a G-rated book, okay? We tend to think that it's full of all just happy, good stuff, but the fact of the matter is that the Bible gives descriptions of a lot of terrible things, and some of the ways that it speaks are fairly dark. And this is one of those cases. The imagery that is being given here is of someone who gets somebody else drunk in order to take advantage of them. The imagery is rape imagery that he is using to describe Babylon. It's dark stuff, right? A few weeks ago, as we were introducing the series, I made mention in one of my illustrations of Bill Cosby, who had been like America's father until it came out that he was drugging women and taking advantage of them, that the guy turned out to be a sexual predator, and that women were his prey. And this is precisely the way in which God is speaking about Babylon here. Babylon is seen as a sexual predator preying upon and taking advantage of those nations that are weaker than them so that they could plunder their goods and take whatever they wanted. Like, that's the imagery here. They're getting other nations drunk upon their wrath so that they can take whatever they want, so that they can take advantage of them. And it's not an accidental thing, right? It's not that they were doing something and, oh, this just happened to be it. It tells us here that this is what they were trying to do. You do this, you get your neighbors drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. That's the point, is in order to shame them, in order to make them exposed so that you can take the things that they have. When Babylon initially raided Jerusalem, what they did to King Zedekiah there is precisely this kind of thing. They took King Zedekiah, they dragged his children in front of him, they killed his children before his eyes, and they gouged out his eyes so that the last thing he ever saw, and the image that would be stuck in his mind forever, would be that of his children being killed in front of him. And this was all meant to humiliate the king and the nation. This was all meant to show to the other nations how weak Judah was and how weak this king was, so that they could plunder them and take their goods and have anything that they wanted. And what it tells us here is that they made them drunk with wrath. That means dizzy and confused, and they did whatever they wanted, like a rapist and a sexual predator. Now, this is upsetting language, right? Like, this is the kind of thing that when you hear this, it's supposed to make you mad. And the reason it's supposed to make you mad, that this nation would do this to other nations, and it would do this to other people, and that it would seek to humiliate them, and it would seek to shame them. And that would be its purpose and its goal. This is supposed to make us mad because it makes God angry as well. God is the one who speaks down this woe. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink in order to gaze at their nakedness. Second of all, we see that they not only shamed, exposed, and took advantage of others, but they poured out violence and destruction. Look at verse 17. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beast that terrified them. For the blood of man and the violence to the earth, to the cities and all who dwell in them. Verse 17 tells us that they committed violence, that there was bloodshed, and it gives us a general and specific way in which their violence occurred. The general way is that they went through and they destroyed and they killed. The destruction of Jerusalem is a perfect example of this. If you look at verse 12, it says, woe to him who what? Builds a town with blood and founds it in iniquity. You look at the second part of verse 17. For the blood of man and the violence of the earth, the cities and those that dwell and all who dwell in them. Jerusalem is a perfect example of this. They went into Jerusalem and they ransacked the city and they destroyed things. And when they had some control over it, they taxed the people so they starved, and they sieged the people so that they starved. And then when they came in, they destroyed buildings and they destroyed the temple. And then going a step further, they destroyed the defensive walls of Jerusalem that Nehemiah would later have to build. They knocked the walls down so that these people were totally and completely exposed, and there was no protection against the wild, and there was no protection against opportunistic people who might come in and steal and kill. Families were torn apart. Exiles were taken. It was horrific, and it was bloody, and it was dehumanizing. And these are the kind of things that Babylon did. This is in general, right? This happened in numerous places, but he also gives a specific example of something that was done that was violent, and that is violence that was done to Lebanon. It tells us at the beginning of verse 17, the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. One thing that Lebanon was known for, if you guys have ever seen a Lebanese flag, it's got a tree on it, right? So one of the things Lebanon is known for is for their trees. And there was a time where the highlands of Lebanon were filled with these beautiful cedar trees, and they had all these forests, and they were full of animals, and it was beautiful. And people would come and purchase the cedars, take the cedars from them, and they would build glorious things. David's palace was built with these cedars. The beams of the temple were cedars from Lebanon. That's what it tells us in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 2. But when both Babylon and Assyria came through, the things that they did is they went into the highlands and they just began to ravage the forest, and they cut down the trees, and they destroyed things so that all of the animals that lived there no longer had a place to live. And it created ecological strain and collapse because of what they were doing to these forests. When verse 17 revisits chapter 2, verse 8, chapter 2, verse 8 says, "For the blood of man, the violence to the earth, and the cities and all who dwell in them." He repeats the same thing here. The violence to the earth here is not just violence to man, but to nature itself. It's violence to the ecology there. They ravaged Lebanon's natural resources, and in the process, it destroyed their economic stability, and it led to suffering on every level. And so Babylon wasn't just about killing people and destroying cities. They would go through and they would clear cut land. They would destroy things so that there was no longer any place for the animals to live, and there was no longer any place for people to get their wood and the things that they needed. And so they would destroy them economically as well as physically. Last week, we spent the whole week in South Dakota, and we were driving through Custer State Park there in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and we had a audio guide. Heather downloaded an audio guide so it would read your position and it would tell you something wherever you'd get to different places. And as we were driving through Custer and we came across a herd of bison, the guy was telling us that there was a time when the bison were numbered in the millions. Wild bison were just roaming the plains. And during the times where the Americans, the settlers, and the Indians were fighting, there was a mass destruction of the bison, and what was once millions came down to like 300. I actually have a picture here. These are skulls of bison stacked up in the 1870s. Now, the reason they did this was not because they wanted to use the bison. They did this because it was a way to drive the natives onto reservations, because the natives hunted the bison. And they knew that if we get rid of all the bison and then they'll have nothing to hunt, they'll have to go on the reservations and they'll have to live an agrarian lifestyle instead of hunting. And so the government allowed people to ride on trains with guns and just shoot them by the millions, destroying these things and just leaving carcasses laying out all over the plains. That's a pretty awful thing to do, is it not? And that's exactly the kind of things that Babylon would do. It wasn't enough just to destroy their cities. You had to destroy their way of life. You had to destroy what they depended on. You had to destroy the ecosystem. You had to destroy all of it in order to subdue people. And so that's what Babylon was doing. They left unlivable wastelands in their wake, taking by force, leaving the people to suffer. And that kind of heartless wastefulness and destruction is not okay with God. It was not okay with God then. It's not okay with God now. If you go back and you start looking at, like, the very first thing God told people to do when he put them on the earth is he told them to be fruitful and multiply. And he told them to subdue the earth and to have dominion over the earth. But that means to take care of it and not just to destroy it. And yet that's what Babylon did. They came in and they destroyed. And then thirdly, they built an empire through death. So they cruelly shamed and exposed and took advantage of people. They poured out violence and destruction. Thirdly, they built an empire through death. This is a catch-all, but verse 12 tells us, "Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity." It bears repeating here. It reminds us that they had little concern for the value of people aside from being a means to an end. People were a commodity to Babylon. They would take them, they would bring them into slavery, they would use them, and they would abuse them. A nation that minimizes the value of life to maximize profits or productivity or maximize their own glory is a nation that's living on borrowed time. And that's something that maybe we as Americans should also be taking into consideration. Like, We might have differing views in this room on things like just war and capital punishment and things like that. But one of the things that I think every Christian, every believer in Jesus Christ ought to be able to acknowledge is that human life has value. And human life has dignity. And the reason it has value and the reason it has dignity is because every single human being you see is a person made in the image of God. And when violence is done to people, and when people are dehumanized and people are oppressed, that is an act of violence against the image of God. And so wherever we see life being taken and being minimized for profit or productivity or for the glory or for legacy of a nation, that's those kind of things that we need to look at and say, this is not okay. This is not okay because people are made in the image of God and God loves people. And therefore, every life taken and all blood shed apart from what God dictates, and there are times that God dictates that death should occur. And there are times that God dictates that people should suffer punishment to the point of death. But when we start doing it on our own to build up our own legacies and in order to make things easier for ourselves or in order to take that which belongs to somebody else, there is judgment for that. For those who treat life as disposable like Babylon did, there was and there were and there are consequences. All of the stuff that they had done, it had been to build for themselves a better world at the expense of people made in the image of God. And so God declares that there will be judgment. You shamed others. You exposed them. You took advantage of them. You poured out violence and destruction. You dehumanized. You oppressed. And through all of this, God says there is a judgment coming for this. The book of Habakkuk shows us the lengths that Babylon goes to secure what it wanted. And if it had to wade through blood and ash and fire in order to get what it wanted, it was a small price to pay. And this kind of wanton violence is problematic. Now, we know that at times God has co-opted violence in order to accomplish his purposes. You know, David was a man with blood on his hands. That's what it tells us in the scriptures. And David said this. He said in Psalm 144:1, he said, "The Lord who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle." David was to be a deliverer of his people. David was to be somebody who secured peace through war. And there are times when God does this, when he uses that as the means in order to accomplish his purposes. But I want you to see in the scriptures that some of what God says, when it's not rooted in God's direction, but in our own sense of justice or our own pursuit of more. In Psalm 11:5, it says, "The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence." That's strong language for God, right? We read in the Bible that God is love and that God loves and that God so loved the world. And if you ever come to a place where it says God hates something, stand up and take note of that. His soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. Proverbs 3:21 says, "Do not envy a man of violence and do not choose any of his ways." Don't choose his ways. Don't follow that. Don't follow that example. Jesus will go on in Matthew 26:52 through 53 when Peter in the garden lashes out and cuts off the ear of the servant. He says, "All who take the sword will perish by the sword." Now we know that at times circumstances can lead to violence. We may be co-opted into it through war or through the defense of our families, but when it is a lifestyle and it is a means of abusing and dehumanizing others, there is a judgment and there is a balance that needs to happen. That's God's position, by the way. That's not my position on that. That when we make a lifestyle of it, when we start to become that thing, when violence is no big deal. You know, sometimes we'll be watching a movie or something, and we'll look to see why is it rated PG-13 or why is it rated this, and they've always put down on the bottom like what's in there, and sometimes you'll see and it's rated R for, and it'll just say violence, or it'll say graphic violence. And a lot of times our response to that is, oh, it's just violence. There's not profanity, there's not nudity, there's not sex, it's just violence. And that's kind of the position that we take, is it's just, but it's not just violence, right? God is the one who says that all who take the sword will perish by the sword. And so what he promises to Babylon here is the promise of shame and death. This is the second point. The promise of shame and death. If you look at verse 16, this is what it says. It says, "You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup of the Lord's right hand will come around you, and utter shame will come upon your glory." Those who live by the sword often die by the sword because God is just. And in these condemnations that we're going to see here in verses 16 and 17, there is a sense of balance as God is taking those who have enacted violence. They're the ones who will then receive it. God will first of all uncover their shame. So going back to the imagery that popped up in verse 15 where he talks about making his neighbors drunk and staring at their nakedness there. It reveals what Babylon was like. He reveals that they were these people who had this rapist mentality, and I'm gonna do what I want. I'm gonna uncover their nakedness. I'm gonna uncover their shame. I'm gonna pursue and take whatever I want from them. I'm gonna humiliate them. I'm gonna shame them. And God's response is that he's going to turn the tables. For those who were going to get the nations drunk on wrath and strip them and abuse them, they would be the ones who are stripped and exposed, and their shame was going to be on display for all to see. What it tells us in the second part of verse 16 is the cup in the Lord's right hand will come around you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. Now, oftentimes in Scripture, wrath is spoken of as a cup of wine. When Jeremiah was prophesying against Babylon and prophesying against Judah, he used this same imagery. In Jeremiah 25:15 and 16, he says, "Thus the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me, take from my hand this cup of wine of wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. They shall drink and stagger and be crazed because of the sword that I am sending among them." That's precisely what Babylon was doing. They were pouring out their wrath so that the people would be stagger and be crazed in order to expose them and expose their wealth. That's part of what they were doing. We're gonna expose their wealth, and then we're gonna take this from them. And so God tells them, you're going to be the ones who drink the cup of my wrath. And in the process, you're going to be the ones who are stripped, and instead of the glory you imagined, you'll be exposed, and your shame will be on view for everybody. That's what it means when it tells us here that you should drink yourself and show your circumcision. You're going to drink this wrath, and you're going to be stripped bare so that everyone can see you for what you are. The idea of circumcision in here, you had Jews, and Jews were circumcised, and the Gentiles were uncircumcised, and that's one of the ways that you could tell the difference. And he said, you're going to be stripped and exposed so that the world can see you for the godless pagans that you are. Now, clearly this is figurative. History does not tell us that the Babylonians were actually literally stripped so that people could see that they were uncircumcised. But it's the language of humiliation, right? What God is saying is, for the shame that you brought upon these people, you will have shame. For the violence done to these people, you will have violence. For the way in which you humiliated them, you're going to be humiliated. Now think again what we talked about last week when Babylon as a nation fell, right? It happened in this nation that went across the earth and just chewed up other nations. Think about how they collapsed. It was under the cover of night. These soldiers came into the city and they killed the king, and that which belonged to Babylon over the course of one night was transferred over so that all the world would see that the Medo-Persians took this from them, and their shame was exposed. That which would have been their glory, this wonderful city and all of the things that they had, would become their shame. But it wouldn't be only humiliation that came for them. God will uncover their shame, but also violence will overwhelm them. That's what it tells us in verse 17. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. Now, when I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of cartoons, and one of the things that I concluded is that using a boomerang was not a good idea. Because if you watch cartoons, you remember, you would always throw a boomerang, and then it would disappear off the screen for a while, and you would almost forget, and then the next thing you know, it comes around and whacks you in the back of the head or does harm to you. And so, we call this the boomerang effect. You try to do something to somebody else, and it comes back on you, and that's exactly what Babylon is going to experience. You do violence to other people, okay, well, guess what's going to come upon you now? Violence and destruction are going to come on you. And we're not given a lot of detail here, except that what they dished out was going to come back in spades. The violence done to Lebanon, that very thing that you did is going to overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. One specific way that this recompense was coming is that those animals, those beasts that were displaced and destroyed in the ravaging of Lebanon would come back and terrorize them. Or more accurately, the terror you rained down on those beasts would be the terror that you experienced. That which you did is what you will experience. A number of years ago, I was preaching through, I think, the book of First Peter, and I gave you an example of prowling predators. I think the sermon was Prowling Predators, Perils, and Promises, or something like that. And in it, I gave this illustration of these tigers in the Sundarbans in Bangladesh. And I told you that, hopefully you'll remember this part, the people kept getting attacked by tigers, and they realized that tigers will only attack from behind. And so they started wearing masks on the back of their heads. This really happens. It still happens today because these people are trying to avoid getting killed and eaten by tigers. And so I talked about that and what happened here. Well, in recent years, people have been wondering, why is it that these tigers are doing this? What has caused them to act out in this way? Because normally, tigers are not hunting down people. Now, you run across one in the wild, it's probably not going to turn out well for you. But why are they tracking down and hunting these people? And what they concluded was that the tiger's natural territory had been shrunk, right? They had been shrunk down into this area because human populations continued to encroach on it. Humans kept hunting the very things that the tigers would hunt. And so you take away their habitat, then your habitat becomes their habitat. And you take away their food, and guess what becomes their food? You do, right? And that's how it works. There's this reciprocal thing happening here where you destroy that which belongs to them, and then they come back out, and they become a threat to you. And here God says that Babylon's destruction of Lebanon was going to lead to them being overwhelmed and terrorized in the same way. Now, this doesn't likely mean that literally the animals that they destroyed or that they displaced were going to come back and attack them, but the idea is that the displaced will raise up and they're going to terrorize just like you terrorized them. And the point is that the victims will eventually come back for the victimizer. And this is something we can observe in the world. This is something that goes on when a people are oppressed. They rise up eventually and they gain power, and what do? More often than not, they do the exact same things that were done to them. This to me is, by the way, one of the strangest things that you can observe. Somebody has a terrible experience, they go through something bad, and then it becomes their single focus to do that to the people who did that to them. So you know how terrible it felt, but now I'm going to go and do it to somebody else. And that's precisely what's going to happen. The victims will eventually come back for the victimizer. And all of this brings us to the point here that violence begets violence. We know this. We observe this. You know, if somebody is abused, they have a much higher chance of becoming an abuser. If somebody lives a life of violence, the chances are that violence is going to overtake them. You know, the last week I was talking about the cartels across the borders in Mexico, and they cross over, and I told you about that drug lieutenant who was living there in El Paso, and he lived in his nice gated home, and everything was fine, and he came out one day, and I assume he came out to get the mail because he came out from the gate, and somebody shot him and killed him there. And this is a man who lived violence, and this is a man who poured out violence, and what got him in the end was somebody came and did violence to him. And that's something here that God co-opts. He orchestrates this coming collapse so that Babylon will receive an eye for an eye, balance and justice. Now, one of the things we have to remember as God's people is that we're not called to balance the scales. We're not called to take an eye for an eye. We're not called to get revenge. We're not called to bring and visit back on somebody what they visited on us. Matthew 5:38 tells us not to take an eye for an eye. Rather, we're to turn the other cheek. Whether we're to let God, according to Romans 12:19, be the one who comes and balances the scales for us. But the thing is that we can have wrongs happen to us, and we can trust that God will be the one who balances the scales. We can trust that God will be the one that takes care of it, that God will be the one who vindicates us and vindicates himself by bringing about justice for the things that people do to us. When we do it, we act as judge, jury, and executioner, and we take something that belongs to God for ourselves. But when God does it, it reminds the world that he is in charge, and it reminds the world that he is the one who ultimately can bring justice. And that leads us to the final point, which is the certainty of divine vindication. You look at verses 13 and 14 here. Start in verse 12. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and builds a city on iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as waters cover the sea. Anybody here ever use your computer and have it freeze up? Never. No? Everybody here has had that happen, right? You go click on something and then it like freezes up and 20 little icons pop up on here. Now, when that happens, when your computer freezes up or the internet captures your computer, what do? You push the button, right? You hit the reset button. Because things have now gotten out of control. There's nothing you can do. What I do is I sit there and I hit the space bar, the mouse, like 47 times, thinking that, 48 was the number I needed to get to in order to get the computer to work. But you try all those things, but eventually we all come to the same place. And maybe it's not where we should come to, but it is where we come to. And that is we take and we push our finger right into that power button and we reset the computer. There is a physical button on every computer that allows you to reset it. It's the reset button. So ultimately, correct me on that. That's good. Thank you for paying attention. You paid attention enough to correct me or try to correct me. But I know there's a physical button on the computer. So ultimately what God is going to do is he's going to push the reset button on Babylon. Not in order to collect it back from the chaos. That's what happens on our computer, right? We have all this chaos that happens, it freezes up. In order to regain control, we reset it. And God's not regaining control, but he's pushing the reset button on Babylon in order to demonstrate that he never lost control in the first place. That he never lost control of the situation. All the labors of Babylon would be consumed by the fire of the wrath of God. When you look at verse 13, when it says here that, behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing? There it's talking about the fact that nations that build for themselves in pride and in arrogance are going to come to nothing. They're going to build all this stuff. They're going to labor in all of these ways, and ultimately it's going to be something that's destroyed by fire. It's not going to have value. It's not going to have the legacy that you think it's going to have, but rather God is going to judge this thing. And the nations, when this happens, they will learn truth about God. That's the subpoint there. The earth will learn the truth about God, what God is like. They will see his power at work, and they will know that there is a God who looks at the earth, who sees what's going on, and who takes seriously the kind of things that are happening on this world. That God has standards, and that God will judge based upon those standards, and the earth will learn about God. You know, prior to August 6th of 1945, most people in this world had no concept of a weapon that could destroy entire cities and that could wipe out tens of thousands of people at one point, at one time. But on that day, August 6th of 1945, in order to bring a quick conclusion to the end of World War II, the President of the United States ordered that a B-29 Superfortress, the Enola Gay, would drop a bomb that was called the Little Boy, a 5-ton thermonuclear bomb onto the city of Hiroshima. And in an instant, 80,000 people were killed and tens of thousands more died in the days that came after that. In an instant, the world entered the nuclear age, and what people suddenly knew was that there was a power that was out there that was so great that there was no way to fight it, and there was no way to survive it. One of the things that we did this last week while we were in South Dakota is we went to the Minuteman Missile Museum. My dad was a missile maintenance guy in the Air Force, and so we went back to where he got his career start in Ellsworth, or right outside of Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota. And they were talking about the Minuteman missile was like the perfect weapon. You couldn't defend against it. You could launch this thing and you could hit Russia in 30 minutes. In fact, there's a vault, and on the door it has the Domino's Pizza logo, and it says delivered in 30 minutes or less, or the next one's free. Like that's some dark humor there. But these nuclear missiles here, these things, there was no way to defend against that. And when this bomb was dropped in 1945, it was a realization that there is something out there that is so powerful that there's nothing that we can do to defend against it. They can kill literally tens of thousands or millions of people at one time with this one weapon. And in seeing that, it changed the world. They suddenly knew there is something greater out there that we should fear. And when God comes in judgment, it brings to people the knowledge that there is a God who is watching, and there is a God who is taking account of what's going on, and there is a God who judges sin and iniquity. And there is a power that is so great that there is nothing we can do to defend against it. So compelling is this power that it tells us in Luke chapter 22, verse 30, that on the day when Jesus reveals himself in judgment to the world, those who have resisted him, they will say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. I'll say, mountains, collapse on us. We would rather a mountain fall on us than have to face the judgment of God. The judgment of God is a serious thing. Philippians chapter 2, verses 10 and 11 tells us the name of Jesus. Every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. When God comes to judge, whether it's a nation in a temporal sense or whether it's the whole world in the final sense, the world will know who God is. They will know what he is like. They will know what he loves and what he hates. They will know what he has determined is sinful. On that day, every crack and crevice in all existence will be flooded with the knowledge of God. This is what he says in verse 14. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God as waters cover the sea. Every crack and crevice will be filled with this knowledge of who God is and what God's like when he comes to judge. And his glory will be made known. That's the last point this morning. His glory will be made known. It's not just any knowledge that people receive when God comes in judgment. It's the knowledge of the glory of God. That Hebrew word there, kavod, that we translate glory, what it means is it means honor or respect. And I want you to think about what goes on with Babylon. Back in chapter 1, verse 11, it says that they worship their might. In chapter 1, verse 16, it tells us that they worship their net. They worship anything but God. But what happens is when he comes to judge and when he expresses his power, when he shows what he can do, it's a moment where people start to take account of the fact that there is a God, and they begin to honor and they begin to revere him. And this doesn't just happen in the collapse of Babylon. The Bible actually gives us a little foreshadowing in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 3, we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're thrown into a fiery furnace because they refuse to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's image, and they refuse to worship. So he throws them in a fire. And then they look in the fire, and they see that instead of 3 people in there, there's 4 people in there. So he calls them out, and they come out, and he realizes that there was what he thought was an angel. We know it was a Christophany. It was Christ who was there in the furnace with them, and he defended them. And this is what Nebuchadnezzar says. He says, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. See, God showing his power, God demonstrating his might is something that causes people to take notice. And this king of Babylon, this pagan king, he says, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then a little bit later he says, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut into pieces and their houses reduced to rubble, for there is no other God who can deliver in this way. Right sentiment, very Babylonian way to deal with it, right? If anybody says anything bad about God, we will cut them to pieces and we'll tear down their house. Why? Because there is no God who delivers like this God. Now he will turn around and take glory for himself and be made to live like an animal for 7 years immediately following this. But that even shows us that when God shows up, even the highest kings bow down. The fall of Babylon and eventually the fall of every godless empire will finally silence the doubters and the skeptics and all of those who say that there is no God, or all of those who don't honor God. And so when God shows his power and his judgment, the nations fall down. And they know him, and they learn about him, and they give him glory, whether they want to or not. Philippians chapter 2, 10 and 11, when it says, at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow in heaven and earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father, that includes those who did not want to do it. That includes those who did not believe in God. That includes all of those who rebelled against God. That includes every single person on earth, every single person in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, wherever they might be. There will be a time where they will acknowledge the glory of God, and this is not a bad thing. Okay, now this is couched in very painful terms here, but the greatest good for all the world is to know that God is here, that He is real, that He is in charge, and that He is taking account of what's going on. The judgment of one provides an opportunity for others to repent. This is, by the way, we preach a book like this. What's the point in me preaching on this tiny book of Habakkuk, which speaks judgment against Judah, and then it speaks judgment against Babylon? What's the point of all of this? It's so that we will acknowledge who God is, and we will realize that God has standards, and we will realize that God will judge, and it gives us the opportunity, each and every one of us, to take account of our own lives, to take stock of our own lives, to say, is there sin? Is there violence? Is there this wrong spirit in me? And if there is, God, I want to repent so that I don't come to a point of being judged for it. So that I can take to myself that which you have offered, which is grace and forgiveness, because here's the reality. God would rather glorify Himself by giving grace than glorify Himself than pouring out judgment. We know this is true. 2 Peter 3:9 tells us, the Lord is not slow to fulfill His promises, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. This is ultimately why we study books like this. This is ultimately why we talk about judgment. And this is ultimately why when some pastor decides we're not going to talk about judgment, we're not going to talk about sin, why they're actually hating their people instead of loving their people. Because we've got to talk about judgment. We've got to talk about that because God is a God who judges. And if we don't start with the bad news of judgment is coming, we're never going to get to the good news of, but God has grace for us. You can't get to grace without judgment. You can't get to grace without sin first. And so we preach through this kind of stuff so that we'll see God has standards. Man, He's got a problem with people taking other people's stuff. He's got a problem with pouring out violence and destruction. He has a problem with making these idols and these images. But guess what? For all of us that have participated in those things, and we've participated in one of them somewhere along the way, and if not, we've at least got pride in there. But for all of that, there is grace. And so we preach judgment. We preach judgment so that people will understand, I am a sinner in need of a holy God's grace. I've offended a holy God, and I need His grace. And so as we said at the beginning of the passages when we started in chapter 2, this all underscores God's credibility. He will bring an end to injustice and wickedness. He will bring an end to this violence and destruction. It's as certain as the sunrise. And those who wield violence and who do not repent, they will feel the judgment of God. But the job for each and every one of us is recognizing this, is to take the message of God's grace in the face of judgment and share it with everyone so that the world may know before He even shows up to pour out judgment who He is and what He's like, and that He is so good. That's what the world needs to know. We don't want people to come to the time where it says every knee will bow and every tongue will confess, and it be people who have received the judgment and the wrath of God. We want it to be people who come to that moment and they're like, somebody told me about the wrath of God. They told me about judgment. They told me about grace. They told me about all of these things, and now I had the opportunity to repent of that and come into a relationship with God so that I bow the knee willingly and receive the grace and goodness of God. So we see in these passages, we see that judgment is coming. But what we desire is for those who have acted in these ways to come to know the grace and the goodness of God, not just the judgment of God. And so that they might live, and so that God may be glorified, not just in enacting justice, but God might be glorified in grace as well. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day that you've given us. And Lord, we thank you so much for the way in which you have taught us through your word. And Lord, as we go through this series and we talk about your judgment, it's easy to just get caught up in that and be like, this is just such an incredibly negative thing, without realizing that without talk of judgment, there is no good news in grace. Lord, the gospel is only good news because every one of us is condemned to judgment. And the gospel tells us that those of us who have been condemned to judgment have a way to get out of that. If we will come to you and we will confess our sins, you will purge us and you will cleanse us of all of those. Lord, if we confess our sins, you are faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And so, Lord, as we look out at the world, Lord, there are two approaches we could take. We could either look at it and say, God's going to judge the world, and I'm glad that all of those who have done me harm are going to get theirs in the end. Or we can look at it and say, God is going to judge the world, and I don't even want those people who have done me harm to have to experience the judgment of God. And so we go forth and we live in grace. Lord, even with Babylon, you sent your people there. They were taken there. But even in that, Lord, you showed yourself, and there were people in Babylon who got to know you. There was a king who got to see and got to declare your glory. There were people that, even in the midst of your judgment on one nation, got to see what a good God you were. And so, Lord God, we trust in you. We trust that you ultimately are in control of all of this. And you've told us to go and make disciples. And you've told us to go share the gospel. And so, Lord, that's what we'll do, so that people can escape your judgment. And that regardless of what they may have done, or regardless of what they may have been involved in, they might experience your grace, so that they don't have to experience your wrath. Lord God, we thank you for this. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Oh, come behold the works of God, the nations at his feet. He breaks the bow and bends the spear and tells the wars to cease. Oh, mighty one of Israel, you are on our side. We walk by faith in God who burns the chariots with fire. Lord of hosts, you're with us in the fire, with us as a shelter, with us in the storm. You will lead us through the fiercest battle. Oh, where else would we go with the Lord of hosts? Oh, God of Jacob, fierce and great, you lift your voice to speak. The earth that bows and all the mountains move into the sea. Oh Lord, you know the hearts of men, and still you let them live. God who makes the mountains melt and wrestle us and win. Oh God who makes the mountains melt and wrestle us and win. Lord of hosts, you're with us in the fire, with us as a shelter, with us in the storm. You will lead us through the fiercest battle. Oh, where else would we go with the Lord of hosts? The oceans roar, you are the Lord of all, the one who calms the wind and waves and makes my heart be still. The earth gives way, the mountains move into the sea, the nations rage. I know my God is in control. nations roar. You are the Lord of all, the one who calms the wind and the waves and makes my heart be still. The earth gives way, the mountains move into the sea, the nations rage. I know my God is in control. Lord of hosts, you're with us in the fire, with us as a shelter, with us in the storm. You will lead us through the fiercest battle. Oh, where else would we go with the Lord of hosts? Lord of hosts, you're with us in the fire, with us as a shelter, with us in the storm. You will lead us through the fiercest battle. Oh, where else could we go with the Lord of hosts?
Amen. Yeah, we didn't realize this ahead of time, but like every song we sang this morning is basically scripture, which is awesome. That's what we should be singing, is the scriptures. But we end on this Psalm 46. I've told people, numerous people, this is one of my favorite psalms because it just reminds me of the control of God, right? We can, in the midst of all of the chaos and all of the things that are going on, it tells us, be still and know that I am God. And that's what we, as we stand in the face of all the things going on around us, we're still and we say, God is in control. It doesn't matter what the governments do. It doesn't matter what the nations do. It doesn't matter what's going on in our culture. God is in control, and we have a job to do, is in this time to tell people about the grace and the justice of God, both of them, so that they can come to know him and escape the wrath that is to come. We end our service in the same way every week, and that is taking an offering. There are offering receptacles on the back wall. We don't pass plates these days, or you can drop your offering in the office door if you would like to do that, or at any time during the week. If you're watching at home, kernvillechurch.com, there is a giving portal on our website that you can give that way if you would like to as well. I'm going to see if the video will play, and if so, enjoy it, and if not, then we'll just be dismissed. So.
When you're a dad, you have to play a lot of roles. Hey, don't eat that. Don't tap on the brain. Okay, Lordy. All right. Oh, you're good. Take a left, turn left. When a man loves a woman, he... Honey! Alrighty, sweetie. This time I want you to concentrate and focus on the ball. You got this. Oh! Sweetie, your date's here. 2 weeks, no TV, no phone. This is my door in my house. I told you not to slam it. You get the door back when I say you get the door back. I told you before. Don't you slam the door in my house. I told you. Hey, knock it off. Don't let me turn this car around. I'll do it. What are you wearing? No, you're not going anywhere looking like that. Go on back upstairs and put some clothes on. Oh! Got it. Ooh, sweetie, open the door. Get the door. Open the door, sweetie. Open. Bye. And Jesus steps in and stops everybody before they start throwing the rocks. And he says, let he who's without sin throw the first stone. You do all of this knowing that one day you will get fired, because we all get fired. But by the grace of God, you might get hired back to be a consultant. Hey, sweetie, what's up?